Thank you very much for coming to my presentation. It means a lot to me that you are interested in the story of the Bicycle Corps, the Buffalo Soldiers. It's a story that is U.S. story. It's not only black history, it's U.S. history. But I have to tell you why, before I go to talk about the Bicycle Corps, I have to tell you a little bit about myself and why I am who I am because of the lady who raised me, which is my mom. When I was 12 years old, my mom took me to see the pyramids of the Mayan and Aztec civilization, temples, pyramids. That's all we did in Mexico. 12 years old, my mom hired a guy to take me to pyramids. I became fascinated with history. To be able to travel through history was amazing. At 12 years old, and I am still that 12 years old. Because I decided 14 years ago I wanted to see this country by bike. And I wanted to take my time. And I've done it. I've seen the whole country by bike except Alaska. And my first trip was from Vancouver, Canada to Tijuana, Mexico. I fell in love with that. I fell in love with the landscape. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with myself. I fell in love with just taking time. And the following year, I decided I'm going to go from Miami to New York City. So I left my house and went to New York City. And in that trip, I got to see history, right? A lot of history through the South, the Civil War. Got up to Jamestown and read stuff that I didn't know about Jamestown, and went to DC, got to see museums, and I was like, wow, this is 2012. Wow, I could travel through history by bike. And that is when, in 2012, I decided I need to travel and see other history by bike. I've always been fascinated with the history of, as a kid, of Lewis and Clark. And I want to run Lewis and Clark. Not through the eyes of Lewis and Clark, but through the eyes of York and Sacagawea. People that are, that without them, if you don't know who York is, it was an African explorer who was a slave. And without him, I don't think they would have been able to do that expedition. But that is something that I didn't know growing up because the books did not tell me that until now that I did some research. But anyways, I could be here talking about. So we'll start the presentation. My first trip historically was the Underground Railroad. 2014, I said, I want to travel through the same path that freedom seekers took to get to freedom. So I started my trip at Congo Square. And when I travel through history, it's very important for me to travel through history. I want to go to historical sites where freedom seekers, freedom fighters took. I want to see the sights. I want to feel their fear. I want to sleep where they slept. I want to eat where they ate, everything. So I found the slave market. I don't need the mic. I found the slave market, and that was my first time traveling through history by bike. And when I travel through history again, I do a lot of research. For me, it's like I don't have a lot of expectations, and you can, as you guys know, traveling by bike, you have to be open. But I do have expectations for myself. I wanted to stay at historically like Underground Railroad stations. Like if I could stay at one railroad station, that would be amazing. If I could see tunnels, would be amazing of the Underground Railroad. When I traveled through history on this, and I know we're here for the Buffalo Soldiers, but I have to tell you how I found the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. So you'll see a lot of rivers on these slides along the Underground Railroad. What I was following is an old spiritual song. A lot of people don't know that it was more of a GPS. It was the way to get to freedom. And it's called Follow the Drinking Gourd. So that was what I was what I was retracing. Now, you could look at some of the information on Follow the Drinking Gourd. This on itself is a presentation, so I can't take a lot of time on this, but we could see, if you read the meaning of it, pretty much says, follow the Tennessee River to the Ohio River, and the big timber will take you to freedom. That was the song in Plantations, but it wasn't a song. It was a GPS. And that's what I follow. So that's what you'll see me in rivers, making sure that I was following the Tennessee River, the Ohio River. I wanted to stay in cabins of the Underground Railroad, sometimes just benches that were not of the Underground Railroad. But this is Ripley, Ohio. On the other side, the hills there, that's Kentucky. On the bottom is the Ohio River. And this is Ripley, Ohio. This is one of the most famous Underground Railroad stations in the history of the Underground Railroad station. I mean, this is the Rankin House. The Rankin House had over 5,000 freedom seekers that came through those doors. And I was number 5,001. I stayed at this place, or I tried. And I around 1 o'clock, I just couldn't sleep. Usually after getting to a location, I just fall asleep. But here, I just knew too much of this history, especially of this, of the Rankin House. And I just I can't sleep. So at 1 o'clock, I just woke up and I said, I'm gonna set everything up and I'm gonna leave. And I wanted to do that as well because the freedom seekers did not travel in the daytime like I was doing. So I wanted to feel the fear that they felt traveling through land that they didn't know. So 1 o'clock in the morning, I left and I went up to Columbus, Ohio. I have so much, again, I did a presentation about this in 2014, and I don't want to focus too much on this expedition, but I have so much experiences that I said, this is the last time I'll do it, right? 2014, I will never do it. Spiritually, mentally, physically, it was very hard. I went back in 2020. And that, again, I said, I won't do it again. But now I'm itching to go back to the Underground Railroad. When I travel through history, I call the names of people that travel. I'm not listening to music, I'm just listening to my thoughts. Sometimes I'm thinking about my mom, my dad, my next Oreo cookie. And most of the time, I'm talking to people that travel the same routes, that travel, and I said, protect me, tell me your story, what happened here? Because obviously the way history has been written, there's a lot of gaps. And I could only connect with those people so they could tell me the story. And it has happened. Again, this is a different presentation, but it also happened on the Buffalo Soldier expedition. I gotta tell you that I got to this house and I was so disappointed because this is the Hubbard House, another famous Underground Railroad station, the last terminal in Ohio of the Underground Railroad station. On the other side of this house is the Erie Lake, right? So from there, most of the people, freedom seekers, will take a boat into Canada. Some will go into Buffalo, right? I got to the Hubbard House and the place was closed. Right? I said that same thing. So I said, well, I'm gonna go to the restroom. I'm gonna go to the library. There was a library, I used the restroom. I couldn't find where the restroom was. And I asked the librarian, hey, where's the restroom? And he, before anything, he says, whoa, where are you coming from, right? He's seen my bike, and so I'm coming from New Orleans, heading up to Canada. I'm retracing the route of the Underground Railroad. And I'm kind of disappointed that the house is closed, and I really wanted to go in there because it's, other than the Rankin House, this is a place that I did a lot of research. He said, no problem, I got the keys. I mean, just telling you, it's raising my skin because I'm like, how does this guy, how did I connect with him? Why did I use the restroom here and not the 7-Eleven across the street? Right? It's kind of like what I just told you. I try to connect. Tell me the story of the history that happened here. I tell that all the time. I'm talking to myself. talking to myself, and I'm calling names of famous conductors of the Underground Railroad. Okay, that's that. On the Underground Railroad, prior to the Underground Railroad in 2000, that was in 2014. In 2010, and this is me, very proud in Niagara Falls after 2,200 miles from retracing the Underground Railroad. So, in 2010, I wanted to know, I'm always questioning. I love soccer, football for me. I love the history of football, but I love the history. Well, I wanted to know the history of bicycle traveling. So I started asking myself, who were the first people that traveled by bike? Why did they do it? Where did they go? And I found a lot of expeditions in 1890s, right? As you guys know, there was a craze of 1890s with bikes. People were just fascinated, right, with the technology of bikes. And so a lot of one person, two people, team expeditions, which I was fascinated, and then I found gold. And I say I found gold because for the first time on all my research, I found people that looked like me traveling by bicycle. And how come I did not learn this in elementary school? How come I didn't learn it in high school? How come I didn't learn it in college? Maybe I would have traveled by bike way before, if I was inspired. If I was inspired by them. I became inspired by them after 2010, and I was just inspired by their bicycles, right? I'm like, wow, nerding out about the bicycle, nerding out that they had wooden wheels in 1896, and we'll talk about that. Nerding out about the landscape that they travel, and I'm like, whoa, fascinated. 6 years later, I started asking myself more questions. Guys, a lot was written about the Lieutenant Moss, who we see in the front. I know everything about Lieutenant Moss. I know where he was born. I know where he died. I know how he died. As a matter of fact, he died in the same corner in New York City that John Lennon was shot. But Lieutenant Moss, a lot has been written about it. I know everything about him. And I could recognize his face in different phases of his life. When he was in the military, when he was in West Point, when he was in the military, when he was older, when he retired. My brother, thank you for coming. So I said, okay, I know everything about him. And when you read this history on Google, on books, you will see that history books always says Lieutenant Moss and the Bicycle Corps. In 2016, 2015, I started asking more questions. Well, who were the Buffalo Soldiers? Who were the Bicycle Corps? Because I'm thinking they have names. I'm thinking these are somebody's great-grandfathers that we should humanize and know their names. And that is the reason why I'm here. Because I started thinking of them, if my great-grandfather or my grandfather did an expedition like this, I'm going to tell the world what my great-grandfather did. So I started connecting with them like family. In 1896, let me go back here. On May 12, 1896, Lieutenant James Moss was given permission to create the Army Bicycle Corps. He was fascinated by the bicycle. Some people call it obsessed. Lieutenant Moss was last in his class. We will not hear much about Lieutenant Moss on this talk, but I have to tell you, I do respect Lieutenant Moss. Without him, a lot of the history would not have been made. But without the men, a lot of the history definitely would not have been made. But Lieutenant Moss, obsessed with the bicycle, graduated from West Point, last in his class. Last in his class. when you were last in his class in those times, you just got whatever was left, and a lot of people did not want to go work in the West. People wanted to stay east of the Mississippi because he was last in his class, and luckily for him, he worked in Missoula, Montana with the Buffalo Soldiers. And in 1896, he was given permission, which actually on May 12 of 1896, it was his birthday, and he was 24 years old, and that was given permission for him to create the Bicycle Corps. There was 3 expeditions. One in 1896 from Fort Missoula, Montana, 125 miles up to Lake McDonald, which we now know as Glacier National Park. 125 miles. Successful. They decided, Army said, well, go a little further. And they went from Missoula, Montana to Yellowstone. About 600 miles round trip. So about 9 of them. 8 bicycle Buffalo Soldiers and Lieutenant Moss. A lot of people don't know this, but the Bicycle Corps, the 25th Infantry of Fort Missoula has a lot to do with the Yellowstone National Park. They actually, some of the infrastructure, some of the roads that are built that we see today were built by them. Okay, so 1896, completed that mission. They loved it. The Army said, go a little further. I see some faces, of some bicycle nerds around here, so I have to tell you a few things. This is the 1896 expedition. Wooden wheels, Ronnie, wooden wheels, right? I was talking about you. Also, no chain guards on the 1896. Now I'm picking a lot of things because in 1896 they didn't have a chain guards. And that's how I'm able to tell as I'm doing my research, because I have a lot of pictures of all the expeditions. And I didn't know which picture was what year, and because it's not documented well. So now I know, doing my research, that the 1896 expedition had a chain guard. The 1897 expedition did not have chain guards. So when you look at some of the pictures, just know that, right? This, probably one of my favorite photos of the 1896 expedition, very Instagrammable. You guys will recognize this picture is Old Faithful. Luckily for us, and to recreate this history, there was a young student that went with it. 19 years old, Edward Booth. Edward H. Booth was 19 years old, fascinated with the bicycles. And he told his dad, I want to go in the 1897 expedition with the black soldiers. His dad says, yes. And I'm so glad that his dad says yes. His dad at the time was the editor of the Missoulian newspaper and says, I need you to ride and take as many pictures as you can and ride every single day. Everything from what are you guys eating, where are you guys camping, everything. Because of that, when I came across that, I started saying to myself 6 years ago, one day I'm going to retrace this route. But I wanted to retrace, and this is not like any other bike rides I've done. I really wanted to pay homage. Again, I took this very personal, and I had to tell the whole story. And I wasn't prepared to do it 6 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. 2021, speaking to a friend of mine, says, what are you doing in 2022? And I said, I want to retrace the history of the Bicycle Corps. It will be the 125-year anniversary. Oh, let's do it. I'll help you with whatever you need. We need to get finance into it. I said, well, I first need to get permission from my wife and the blessing from my wife to be able to do this, right? And I spoke to my wife, and I'm so glad that I I had the perfect mom growing up, and I have the perfect wife growing up. And when I say perfect, it's that they recognize my spirit. And immediately, before I even finished telling her about what I wanted to do, she understood and says, you have to. We have a child. He's only 18 months. We'll figure it out. It's a sacrifice for the family, but she says, as a black woman, it's very important for you to tell the story of the Bicycle Corps because it's their legacy that you're going to be telling. So, got my wife's blessing, and now I'm committed. And now I'm prepared. Because like I mentioned, I had everything that Edward Booth wrote. Everything. But I also have the whole journal of Lieutenant Moss, the synopsis of the trip. And later, if you want to nerd out, you're welcome to get closer. But here, with his information, now I knew where they went. But I also came with the synopsis of the trip, June 14, all the way up to July 24th, and everything from weather, wind pattern, condition of the roads. Gold. Okay, now I'm getting ready because now I could tell where they went. Came across newspaper articles at the National Archives in DC. This is from Falls City. I have many clippings. This is from Falls City, Nebraska, and July 23rd, 1897. A lot of etchings, right? Because of that era. And I could tell not only by the synopsis of the trip from Lieutenant Moss, by what Edward Booth wrote, but also newspaper articles. What happened in each town, how they felt about black troops coming through. Then, to finalize it, I came across the 1897 original map of the expedition. I'm so excited. Because now I'm able to tell towns that they went to. And I'm able to see the landscape from Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri. And I started nerding out about this, geeking out, because I'm like, why is this shaded? And why is this line like this? So I started finding out more. I'll tell you some of the stuff, but this area in Nebraska, the sand hills of Nebraska, was the toughest part of this expedition. The whole expedition is grueling. The whole expedition was grueling. I mean, up here, crossing the Continental Divide right now, hard. Crossing McDonald Pass on a single speed. Forgot to mention that in 1896, it was wooden wheels. In 1897, they learned a lot, so they changed it, and they had steel wheels and the chain guard, right? But still, they had to push. They had to push bikes a lot. Water was really hard to find, especially coming out of Montana, there's a lot of water. Wyoming, there's a lot of water. Rivers, things like that. But as you get to South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, towns are very far apart. Nebraska was actually, there was rarely any towns. They became ill in South Dakota, Etchman, South Dakota, because over 10 people drank this contaminated water. Luckily, then I said, well, what is this line here? Then I found out that line was a railroad track. A railroad track that ran from Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri, and it was two railroad tracks actually. One is the Northern Pacific Railroad track that connected to from Montana to Wyoming. That's the Northern Pacific Railroad track. Then South Dakota, Nebraska, and Missouri is the Burlington Railroad track. Why the railroad track is so important? why the railroad track is so important. And you'll see, just like on the other slide, you saw a lot of rivers, you will see a lot of pictures of railroad tracks on this slide. But the railroad track was essential for them because they only carried about 50, they carried 2 days worth of food. They wanted to ride, Lieutenant Moss wanted to ride 50 miles every single day. Every single day. He didn't care if it was raining, if it was snowing, if it was hot. And sometimes in the sand hills of Nebraska, got up to 110 for them. But he didn't care. He wanted to ride 50 miles every day. So they have food for 2 days. Food, when I talk about food, they're talking about cans of beans, bacon, flour, and of course, coffee. And in places, they would buy meat, eggs along the way, if they could find it. This video I'm not able to play, but you could see it on the film. And it's so interesting. Maybe I'll tell you about this. But look at the sky. I'm in the backcountry woods. For the most part, I would say this route is now, I probably completed about 93 to 95% of the route historically. I wanted to do 100%, but it was hard to go through people's living room. You have to understand that in 1897, there was a lot of public land. Now we have a lot of private land. So I got very close to people's house, and I got kicked out 3 times of private land. And that's how committed I was to this project, you know. The other part happened in just outside Bozeman, where there was reports that they crossed a railroad bridge. And it's in the back countryside. And I found the railroad bridge. I was like, oh, this is the railroad bridge that they took. And somehow, a guy appeared out of nowhere. Again, this is not this picture, but I'm sorry. This is the backcountry woods of Montana. And this county employee, like an environmental county employee, came by and said, hey, what are you up to? I'm like, oh. He wasn't questioning why I was there, but he just wanted to know why I was there because there's nobody else. And I was just looking at the bridge like this and looking at the landscape. And I show him pictures of my heroes. And I said, they came through here. I know that. And he said, yeah, probably. It was the only way to pass. But if I was you, I won't do it. Because if you remember in the summer, the rivers in Yellowstone and really everywhere in Montana were coming up fast. This is the Missouri. And he said, you will get hit by a train, or if the train comes, you got to jump into the river. So you will die either way, right? You die either way. And I was like, ooh. Then I started thinking about people that may come behind me. And that's really, because I feel like I'm very protected. Yeah. I feel like I'm very protected. And I've been very lucky to travel to this country and nothing has ever happened to me. And so I'm like, oh, I think I can make it. And I'm so obsessed. Did I tell you I'm obsessed with this history? So I'm like, I have to go through. But then I started thinking about the people that may want to do it. Potentially my son. And if he gets hurt, I can't. You know what I mean? So, but then I started thinking about my wife if I get home. So if I would have got killed either by the train, by the river, or she probably would have killed me that I took that trip, you know? So I was like, nah, I'm just going to leave it alone. But I got connected. I got connected to the history and I kept calling the names of the writers. As I'm writing, I'm calling out Private John Finley. Tell me what happened through here. Because the accounts that I am able to share with you is through the eyes of the military. I want to know what my heroes thought about. Again, I told you what I think about. I think about my mom sometimes, my family, the next Oreo cookie. What did they think about? I'm not able to know that. Those are the gaps that I get emotional about. But when I was coming through the backcountry of Wyoming, 40 miles of traveling, well, it started raining hard, thundering. I'm in the backcountry of Wyoming going into South Dakota. They only spent 1 day in South Dakota and they crossed over into Nebraska. It started coming down really hard. As a matter of fact, there was a pickup truck of some guys. They were like, dude, you know, they were going the opposite way. We're on the gravel. They're on a big Toyota Tundra. And they pulled their windows down like, dude, what the F are you doing? Like, get under the tree. And I'm like, no, before it rained, I knew as a bikepacker, as an experienced bikepacker, I have two options. I either camp out here in the middle of nowhere, or I just push. I push 40 miles, and to please come in, I push 40 miles and get to Etchman, South Dakota. And I did that. And then they just probably thought I was crazy. And so I'm coming, you know, one of the things about going through the backcountry is that you don't see no cars, you don't see no people. I'm just connecting with nature. But the one thing that I don't like about going through the backcountry is the welcoming sign of each state, right? Like when I go through the highway, it says, "Welcome to South Dakota." It's kind of warming, right? But here, there's no signs, right? I don't know. I could only tell by my map that I am getting closer to South Dakota. Guys, I'm having this thought, and I look to my right, and there comes these wild horses. This is a wild country, Wyoming. 3 wild horses get next to me, and I'm like, oh my, I'm from the city, so I don't know much about horses, right? So I felt that they wanted to take me out. So these guys are gonna take me out. The way they were breathing was hard, and they were just coming, stumping. And I'm like, whoa. The reason why I have this photo, and there's a video, is because I am telling you the honest truth. I thought that was the last video that I was ever gonna take. And that this is how I went out, guys. So I took my GoPro and I filmed the whole experience. And they came and they got next to me in information. And they just followed me. And then I realized they wanted to take me out. They could have taken me out because I'm not that fast, guys. I'm not that fast. And Ronnie, you know that, right? So then they kept following me, and it was the most beautiful. It was a highlight of my trip. It stuck to me for 2 days riding by bike. How come these 3 horses appeared? I can only tell you my perception of this is probably, as a lot of you may know or may not know, the Buffalo Soldiers were the best horsemen that the military had. Before, there was the 9th and 10th Cavalry. They were really amazing horse riders. As a matter of fact, I didn't know this until I went to West Point. They told me that later on, they hired Buffalo Soldiers to come to West Point to teach how to ride the bikes and maintain the horses. They were amazing horses. So then I wonder, were they descendants of horses that rode with Buffalo Soldiers? Spirits? That's how I just took it, you know, and that's the beauty of traveling by bike and traveling through history. But I really loved this highlight, and when I got to the place I was camping out, I called a friend of mine who is an instructor, horse instructor, and I said, man, I think these horses were trying to kill me. And he's like, no, relax. Their ears were up. He saw the whole video. It's like they were just curious, you know. So now I know a little bit more about horses. But guys, so going back to this expedition, a lot of railroad photos. The railroad was very important. That's how they got fed, and they had to go every 100 miles to stations to get supplies, food, wheels, tires. That's how, so they have food for 100 miles, and every 100 miles, they got rations. Sometimes they did not make that 100 miles, and they will have to ride either, there was incident for 50 miles they rode without food and without water. They would get on the railroad tracks a lot because of the mud, of the rain and things like that, and they knew that they could advance faster by getting on the railroad track. One of my favorite photos, because you see them on formation. Again, it's so important for me to travel through history. I want to see what they saw. I want to experience what they experienced. So on one of my research, I saw when they were going over the Continental Divide, I saw one of the etchings that we've seen on those articles, right? And this is a newspaper in Helena, Montana, that was talking about when they went through. And when I was going through some of my photos after my expedition, I realized that that's actually going over McDonald Pass, over the Continental Divide, and looks similar. I called the names of soldiers like John Finley, John Wilson, Elwood Foreman, Mingo Sanders. And 6 months prior to going on my expedition, I said, if I could stay at Fort Harrison. Fort Harrison is just over the Continental Divide in Helena, Montana. I called almost every day. They probably had me registered already, because I called all the time and I said, please, I am doing this work and I want to stay here. Why? Because they stayed in Fort Harrison, coming through Helena. So it was very important for me to stay in those places, especially military bases. I'm not military, I've never been military, so they would say, unless you come with someone military, you're able to stay here, otherwise you can't. Okay, so again, I call the names of those guys, tell me the story that happened here. Why? Tell me. Because again, there's a lot of gaps in the books. I get to Fort Harrison, and I was like, well, I'm just gonna go. I was staying about 2 miles from there at a campsite, and get to Fort Harrison, and I wanted to go to the military museum, which anyone could visit. So I just went into the base and went to the museum, and when I'm parking my bike, I look up and there's a lady just waving, like happy to see me. And I'm like, I didn't know why she was so happy. I was like, who is this lady? Maybe I was like looking someone, maybe she's saying hi to somebody else. She came down and said, I just saw you on the news. You are retracing the route of the Bicycle Corps. My God, thank you for doing that. And that was the first time that I've talking to someone from living Missoula to Helena that was that excited. She said, what can I do for you to make your stay here? I said, I want to stay here. Can you make it happen? She said, I'm the colonel of this. So it's a female colonel who is in charge of the whole fort. She said, I could make it happen. So she placed a call. She's on the phone and saying, they want to know if you want to stay at the campsite or in the barracks, which is now a hotel. I said, I want to stay in the barracks. My guys paved the way for me to stay in the barracks. Yeah. So, again, I read a lot of reports that says when they were going through western Montana, I started loving flowers and trees and things like that because of my wife. She's a gardener. So to include her on my research, I would tell her things, especially if it has something to do with flowers and things. So there was reports that the Buffalo Soldiers, when they were going through Montana, they kept seeing these flowers everywhere, wildflowers. And when I saw them, I said, these are the flowers they probably were talking about, because I see them everywhere. I got to Ovando, Montana, and I spoke to a journalist who also loves plants. And I said, look at these photos. What are these flowers? They're everywhere. She said, she mentioned the name of it, which I have it written down somewhere. And she says, we haven't seen those flowers in years. So somebody put those flowers there for me to see the history of what they saw, right? That's how when I'm going through history, I'm like, how'd that happen? She hasn't seen these flowers for years. The Buffalo Soldiers, that's all they kept talking about, these flowers, these flowers. Now I want to know more. I want to go find more places. So I get to Big Timber, Montana. And there's reports that say that there was a Civil War veteran having a drink at this tavern. And when he saw the Buffalo Soldiers come in, he got so excited, right? Which I got excited to read that because they experienced a lot of racism, especially in Nebraska and Missouri. But they also had some highlights, right? So this Civil War veteran, excited to see black men on bikes, waved them and says, I want to buy everyone a drink, right? And they were invited to have a drink at this tavern. Now, I didn't have names of the tavern, but I was like, I got to find where this tavern is. So luckily, guys, I was working with about 3 historians that helped me put this together. And I called one of them. Almost daily, I was in communication with them. Where is that tavern? Because I got to Big Timber. He said, I think we got it. I think we know which one it is. I said, how? Well, there's only 2 taverns in this little town of Big Timber, Montana. So process of elimination is how we did our research, right? One is from 1960s. That couldn't be it. And then this one from the 1890s. That was the place that they had the drink. And Grand Hotel. Now, they weren't welcome to stay in Big Timber. They didn't stay at this hotel. They had to stay in the back country of Big Timber, but they got a free drink here. So I went inside and I had to tell everyone about these guys. I thought that everyone knew, right? I said, hey, did you guys know the history, the owner, the new owner, right? The manager, the bartender, I'm telling everyone. I said, you know the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, the bicycle corps that came through here, they got a free drink because the Civil War soldier honored them and give them a free drink. Like, we didn't know. But then, shoot, we owe you a drink. Now I don't drink, but I did get that orange juice, and I drank it proudly in the bar where the Buffalo Soldiers had a drink. That's very emotional for me. And then, in Wyoming, that hotel, Hotel Antler, I always thought that the whole expedition traveled together. And then I learned that sometimes Lieutenant Moss, sometimes the doctor, and sometimes the journalist will get on the train and says, we're going to go do some logistics, and we're going to go to the next town. So you guys, and there was always a black officer in charge of them. But we'll see you on the next town, guys. And one of those towns was here in Wyoming, outside Moorcroft, Wyoming, Hotel Antler. Right there where I'm standing is where Lieutenant Moss, the journalist, and the doctor met up the rest of the expedition that they came. So that was pretty interesting to me. I was like, oh, I thought they all traveled together. How come? Interesting. And I'm only able to tell you this is because I read newspaper articles, I read his report, I read journalists, and I'm able to piece things together that hasn't been told correctly. So these guys traveled together, formation, met up with them there. And a photo that I don't have here is that when I traveled through some of these towns, I already knew where I was going, right? I knew that the Hotel Antler was in this town. I just didn't know where it was. But speaking to a person that was working there, because the cafe is still there, so I had a nice Americano. I told them about the Buffalo Soldiers and the Bicycle Corps that went here, and she's like, oh yeah, heard this guy always talks about them. He's about 90 years old. You need to talk to him. So, ooh, yes, because there's a lot of things that I don't know, and only locals know some of the things, and that's why I'm able to piece together. So I went across the street to this candle store, and he wasn't there, but his wife was there, and then she called him, and we met up, and he told me something I didn't know, and I had to do some research, and I found that it was true. 25 miles out of the Hotel Antler, they found a lake, a river lake, a salted river lake. And they hung out there for 3 hours. Imagine that. As grueling as this expedition was, there were some highlights. They hung out, they swam for 3 hours to heal their muscles, and they salted. I was like, oh, I gotta go there, and I gotta go into that salt water. But the salt water, he gave me the location. I found it, but it's no longer a lake, it's covered. But I did my research, and with Google Earth, I could see that there's like a circle that looks like a lake. So that was fascinating, because that's something that I did not know. But later I discovered that it was written, and it was true that they did that. Okay, one of my favorite photos is this one. One of my favorite photos is this one because when I came across, I saw their faces. And then in my phone, I was able to zoom, and I saw their faces, features. And I said, whoa, their faces are pretty fresh. Because I seen photos when they arrived, you could see their faces, it was grueling. But here, they were fresh. So this had to happen early on in the expedition. Later I found out through the help of a historian, this is in Livingston, Montana. And this is one place where they had to wait, and they actually were waiting for the train to arrive to get the next supply. I love this picture for many, many reasons. The face recognition, how proud he is here. I love his style. But I also love the locals, because I read that they dealt with a lot of racism along the way. But locals were fascinated by what they were doing, and they would come in and ask them a lot of questions. So I love that. And a lot of the photos that I have, that happen a lot. You see photos of people on top of them just trying to find out. But I wanted to know where it was, and found out it was Livingston, Montana. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. I'm going through Livingston, and when I get there, I hope that I get to see with the train station. I hope I get to see that beautiful building in the background. So what I did, with the help of a historian in Wyoming, at Gillette, Wyoming, at the museum there, we colorized this photo, because I'll tell you why. I'll tell you now why I did it, and why I'm colorizing photos, because I realized that I have the name now of all 20 cyclists. I know where they were born. I know where they died. I know where they're buried. Every single one of them. I know if they have kids. I actually met one of the descendants of Mingo Sanders recently. But what I don't know, and for some reason, for 125 years, no one questioned that, is I have the name of every single one of the soldiers, but now I don't know what name goes with what face. That brought tears to my eyes, because I connected to them like they were my great-grandfather. And this is someone's great-grandfather that needs to be recognized, because this is epic. This is U.S. history, it's cycling history. It needs to be told the right way. It needs to be told the right way. Right now, I'm only able to tell you half, because only when I'm able to recognize them by face is when I'm able to tell the full story of the Bicycle Corps. 3 years ago, I made a commitment to myself and to the Bicycle Corps that I will not do another ride until I'm able to recognize every single one of them. And with the help of historians, we're now able to recognize 8 of them by face. I need 12 more that I'm working on. But that is the reason why I had to colorize it, because we're able to see that there's 5 of them that rode in the 1896 expedition of Yellowstone. And now, because of that expedition, I'm able to recognize all 9 of the riders. But this one, I'm stuck. But it's so important for me, not only because they're human beings, but when my son grows up, I want to tell him who my heroes are. So I cannot tell him right now. Well, one day I will. I get to this town, Livingston, Montana. I say, I got to recreate this picture if I'm able to find where the buildings are. I get there around 4 o'clock, right? You're a photographer. I get there at 4 o'clock, and there was a big shadow in front of where my bike is. But before I tell you this story, is that all I travel with is my GoPro and my little iPhone 12 Max, which I'm going to upgrade when I get home. But this photo on the left has been around for 125 years. And I need to take a photo, not a selfie with my iPhone, but I need someone to pay homage to this photo. So I asked someone at the cafe, do you know anyone that could take this photo? Again, remember I told you when I traveled through history, I asked the guys, tell me what happened here. I think this is one of them situation. This guy randomly says, I know a photographer who's about 3 stores down. Let's call him up and see if he could come. The guy comes and says, immediately says, I know what photo you want to recreate. And I say, how do you know? He says, I was the one who digitized the original photo for the museum. How do you have this photo? He says. He got very personal. I was like, ooh. I told him I've been doing research for over 6 years. But he was really wanted to know how I got that photo, because he thought only the museum had it. So I'm glad that he showed up, because these guys took pride on taking this photo. But study that photo, right? I tell you, I arrived the day before. There was a big shadow in front of me. It was 4 o'clock, 4:30, and he said, I can't take this photo. I said, whoa, what do you mean you can't take this photo? He said, there's a big shadow. I can't take it off. You got to come back. He looked at his fancy app, and he said, you got to come back between 12 and 2 o'clock. Which made sense, because they were there for lunch. So they probably went around that time. So it's about the same time that we took this photo. But I said, oh, if I take this photo and I take a day off tomorrow, if it's 2 o'clock, I'm not going to start riding 50 more miles. So I said, I have to take a day off just to take this photo. Right? It's some of those things that go in my head. That's the beauty of traveling by bike, because it tells you and teaches you to stay in the present moment. And I was already thinking about tomorrow. I gotta ride, because what I was doing, and one of the things that I didn't tell you, is that I rode mile by mile, day by day with the expedition. June 14 of 1897, when they left Fort Missoula, I left Fort Missoula June 14 of 1897. But I also left at 5:40 in the morning, which is the time that they left. I actually had to cut out. I was being interviewed. That interview that Colonel saw me on TV, I cut it out because they took too long, and it was like 5:39, and I said, I'm so sorry, but I need to go. And I cut that interview out. It's that important, the details that it was important for me to honor them. But again, so if I take a day off, and they only took 2 days off, rode 50 miles every single day. That means that I will have to ride 100 miles the next day to catch up with the expedition. I'm like, all for this photo. I'm like, do I do it? But the photo will be epic to show you guys. So I just said, hey, my son. So I said, I'll be back. And I came back at 1 o'clock. We took the photo. But this guy really took pride on this. And that is like, I was like, oh man, out of everyone in this town, I met the right photographer. Because he says, you got to put your arms like this. I was like this. He's like, no, put it like this and put it like this and move your bike angle like this. And then he measured this distance to the building and he made them. And then also look at this. Look at where his head is. Look at where my head is. Oh, geez. Yeah. That's what I said. And oh, I just saw it. That guy is looking at them and is looking at me. I didn't think about it. But those are the things that fascinates me about traveling through history. It's just the connection with people that I'm like, how'd this happen? I know how it happens. Okay, we're almost, yeah, I can't, it's hard to do this in 1 hour, guys. But we're almost there, okay? So, it was not only about a ride for me, but it's about giving them the dignity and tell the truth about this expedition the books try to forget. What I said about that is I already told you my mission, and I will not do another ride until I'm able to recognize every single one by name. Because I just had a podcast 2 weeks ago by Nat Geo. I was on their podcast and it was like, they already wanted to know, what's your next expedition? I'm like, I have many in my head. I mean, many. I mean, for like 5 lifetimes, right? I will not be able to do all of them, but I told them that I cannot continue because the way I go into the research that I put in, then I will forget about them, which I can't. So, but then when remember I was telling you earlier, I know where they were born. I know where they die. I have marriage certificates. I have everything. But there were some guys that I know where they're buried because I have the cemetery. But there are some guys that he died in Chicago, but I don't know where in Chicago. And this is one of them. Without this guy, Private John Finley, which is one of my favorite writers of that expedition, without him, I know for a fact they would not have been able to complete the expedition. I know for a fact. He was the mechanic of the expedition. Look at that frame back, huh? I'm talking, I started, and most of you guys know that I started hashtagging the original bikepackers because I just like, the frame backs that we use today were used back in 1897 by my heroes. The box that he has, so most of the bikes weighted between, when I say weighted, meaning the bike and gears, between 58 to 60 pounds. Now this was about 75 pounds because he carried most of the time about 15 pounds over with the tools and all that. But he was such a strong rider. Luckily for the Army, he was a mechanic in Chicago prior to enlisting in the military. So when the expedition came about, he raised his hand and said he wanted to volunteer. Without him, they would not have. You know why? The Lieutenant Moss was so fascinated with the 50 miles every single day that this guy barely slept. When the guys were sleeping, he was fixing bikes and then riding with the group. And there was a couple of times that the bikes weren't ready and he will give his bike, take the box out, give his bike and ride the one that he was working on and then catch up to the expedition. Not by train, but by bike. They would not have been able to do it without him, John Finley. Then I found out, okay, he went back after the service, he went back to Chicago, but I can't find where he was buried. And I realized that he was buried without a grave marker. And I'm realizing now, because talking to historians, I just told them that, I say, I have all these people and I don't know where they're buried, but I have these people that I know where they're buried. They said, maybe they don't have grave markers. So we started working 3 years ago to making sure that every single writer of the 1897 expedition had a grave marker. For 3 years, we started working with the VA to make sure that we get a marker for John Finley. And it took forever. It took forever. But we did a lot of research, and obviously it took a lot because they wanted to make sure that the person who's buried is the person who we thought it was, and he was. We did the research, and 8 months ago, about 3 months prior to me going on my expedition, I got the best news, and we received a plaque to put in his marker in Chicago, and he's buried in Arlington Cemetery in Chicago. And I am working on a second soldier. His name is John Wilson. And now I know what they want, right? Because I never worked with the VA. I'm not military. So it was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I'm like, oh my God. But now I have a formula, and I know exactly what they want, and I'm going to give it to them to make sure that every single one of them receive a grave marker. I don't know a lot of the things. This is funny. I don't know their. They didn't have a journal, right? They didn't write like I was writing, right? So I was like, damn, I wish I knew who these guys were. Not only by name, not only by face, but I want to know their personality, right? So I know when I write with some of you guys, I know your personality. I want to know their personality. But I couldn't. So this one here, I'm almost done, right? Give me 2 minutes, maybe 3. This guy is one of the guys that I'm able to recognize because his name is Elwood Foreman. The only reason I'm able to recognize him is my wife is from Kansas City. They had a baseball team that was very, very good at the 25th Infantry at the base. He made it to the Negro Leagues, and he played for Kansas City Monarchs, and we were able to see his face. And then I'm like, whoa, this is the guy that rode in the military, and I got his name, and now I got his face. But he was the joker. He was the one that kept everyone smiling, right? He the one that had the best sense of humor. And you could tell by a few quotes that I have from him. Everyone sitting at the campsite, and he says, there was no bicycle 100 years ago. Oh, I wish I lived 100 years ago. Yeah, that's how grueling this expedition. There was another time where they were riding, and he says, I want a mule for my kingdom. But he didn't have any kingdom, but that was just it was just so funny. And the last thing that I know about him, he asked the Lieutenant Moss, if I could, Lieutenant Moss, can I wear your class ring from West Point? That told me a lot, because he told me that they had a good relationship, that someone that was supposed to be superior, he would say, can I wear your ring? And Lieutenant Moss said, no, they will think you an officer, you know? So I love those kind of things. And guys, that is Foreman, and I could tell their personality and his personality. Look how he's wearing that hat. Everyone had the same hat, but everyone will wear it different. Yeah? So this is one of the most beautiful photos, and a lot of you guys have seen. I'm almost done. It's hard to do this presentation in 1 hour because there's so more that I want to share with you, but it's 6 years of research that I've done to pay homage, to shine a light to a piece of history that has not been told correctly. It needs to be told. And it's important to be told because there's a video. I speak with kids at elementary school and middle school, and they're like fascinated. Like, I want to do what you do, but it seems like I spoke at the Youth Bike Summit 5 years ago, and one kid came up to me and says, I love what you do, but it's for white people. And I know what he meant, right? I know that he has not seen himself on magazines, maybe on Instagram, that this lifestyle is for everyone. But we need to tell the stories, guys. And that is why it was so important for me to tell this story, because I want some kids, my kid, to know that there were black men, before there were soldiers, there were black men traveling by bike. And that gave me a sense of pride, guys. So I always leave with a call of action. We have the responsibility not to just enjoy the outdoors, but to acknowledge those who inspire us and came before us. I had a friend who's a historian, told me once, he says, you die twice. Once when you physically die, and a second time when no one speaks your name. And that is the reason for this project. Thank you, guys.